In Hereditary, 2018, the story opens with the death of Ellen Lee, the matriarch of the Graham family. At 78, Ellen passed away at her daughter Annie's home after years of battling illness. Her funeral is a quiet affair, marked by a strange, almost uneasy atmosphere. Annie, Ellen's only child, is left to deliver a eulogy that hints at the complexity of their relationship. Ellen was distant, secretive, and as Annie admits, a difficult presence in her life. Annie lives with her husband, Steve, a pragmatic and calm man, and their 2 children. Peter, a typical aloof teenage boy more interested in his social life than his family, and Charlie, their youngest, a peculiar and withdrawn 13-year-old girl who seems unnervingly attached to her late grandmother. Charlie is unlike other kids her age. She has a habit of crafting eerie sculptures, makes a distinct clicking noise with her tongue, and often seems lost in her own world. Her odd behavior becomes a recurring undercurrent of tension. Not long after the funeral, strange events begin to unfold in the Graham household. Annie discovers some of Ellen's belongings, including a mysterious book on spirituality, which contains an unsettling note addressed to her. Meanwhile, Charlie, struggling to process her grandmother's death, begins experiencing eerie occurrences. She claims to see Ellen's presence and even witnesses unsettling visions, such as a figure standing in flames. The family begins to feel as if Ellen's influence hasn't entirely left. Peter, in contrast, is preoccupied with more mundane teenage troubles. At school, he daydreams and chats with friends about an upcoming party, completely ignoring his studies. Charlie, similarly distracted, has an encounter at school where she finds a dead bird, cutting off its head with a pair of scissors she carries around. This bizarre moment is followed by Charlie noticing a mysterious woman watching her from a distance, someone unfamiliar yet eerily fixated on her. At home, Annie finds herself drawn to her mother's room, only to discover the door mysteriously open. She asks Steve if he's been in there, but he denies it, leaving her unsettled. Feeling haunted by memories of her mother and the mounting oddities, Annie joins a support group for people dealing with loss. There, she opens up about her troubled family history. Her father had severe mental illness and died by starvation, while her brother suffered from schizophrenia and took his own life at just 16. Annie fears that her family's dark legacy might somehow affect her own children. The tension escalates when Peter asks Annie for permission to attend a party. Reluctant but wanting to avoid confrontation, Annie agrees, but on one condition: he must take Charlie with him. At the party, Peter becomes engrossed in flirting with a girl he likes, leaving Charlie to wander. She eats a slice of cake, unaware that it contains nuts, which triggers a severe allergic reaction. Gasping for air, Charlie seeks out Peter, who panics and rushes her into his car. The journey to the hospital becomes a nightmare. Charlie struggles for air, leaning out of the car window in desperation. In his panic, Peter swerves to avoid a dead animal on the road, but the maneuver is catastrophic. Charlie's head strikes a utility pole with fatal force. Shocked and overwhelmed by what has just happened, Peter drives home in silence, leaving Charlie's decapitated body in the car. The next morning, Annie discovers the horrific scene, her screams of anguish piercing the quiet dawn. The death of Charlie fractures the family even further, plunging them into a grief that will soon become a doorway to something much darker. The weight of Charlie's death looms over the household. Peter becomes withdrawn, haunted by guilt and unable to sleep, while Annie, consumed by sorrow, starts sleeping in Charlie's old treehouse. Steve, trying to hold the family together, remains stoic but distant. Yet the strangeness surrounding the Graham family only deepens. Unseen forces seem to be at play, and a shadow of malevolence begins to creep into their lives, but no one can yet imagine the horrors that are to come. Following Charlie's death, the Graham family exists in a suffocating haze of grief. Annie's mental state deteriorates rapidly, and Peter, racked with guilt, becomes increasingly isolated. Tensions between mother and son boil just below the surface, threatening to erupt at any moment. Meanwhile, strange and inexplicable events continue to unfold in their home, further unsettling Annie and the rest of the family. One day, Annie decides to return to her support group, desperate for solace. There, she meets Joan, a kind and understanding woman who listens intently as Annie pours out her anguish. Joan empathizes, sharing her own experiences of loss, and gives Annie her address, offering her a safe space to talk anytime she needs. Joan's warmth is comforting, and Annie finds herself drawn to this seemingly compassionate stranger. At home, the sinister presence that lingers around the family begins to escalate. Annie discovers that Charlie's sketchbook is somehow still being used. New drawings appear in its pages, depicting Peter with his eyes scratched out. Startled, she attempts to destroy the book by burning it, but something inexplicable happens. As the book begins to char, Annie's arm catches fire, seemingly connected to the object in some supernatural way. Fearing the consequences, she extinguishes the flames and locks the book away. Peter's psychological state is worsening, and he starts experiencing bizarre and terrifying episodes at school. During one class, a strange light appears on the wall, leading to Peter seeing his own reflection smiling back at him maliciously, completely independent of his actual expression. In another instance, his body seizes up, and he violently slams his head against his desk, leaving him injured and terrified. These incidents unsettle his classmates and teachers, and Steve is called to take him home. Feeling increasingly alone and unable to cope, Annie decides to visit Joan at her home. Joan enthusiastically welcomes her and reveals something astonishing. She has recently conducted a seance to communicate with her deceased grandson. Annie is skeptical but intrigued, and Joan demonstrates the ritual by moving objects and speaking directly to what she claims is her grandson's spirit. Though shaken, Annie is also mesmerized by the possibility of connecting with Charlie once more. Joan gives her specific instructions on how to perform the seance at home, along with a warning: everyone in the household must participate, and Annie must be completely sincere in her efforts. Later that night, with Steve and Peter reluctantly in tow, Annie performs the seance. The atmosphere is tense, and Annie's voice trembles as she calls out to Charlie. To everyone's shock, the ritual appears to work. Objects move on their own, and Annie seems to become possessed, speaking in Charlie's voice and mannerisms. Peter is horrified and begs for it to stop, while Steve, ever the skeptic, douses Annie with water to snap her out of the trance. But whatever they've summoned refuses to leave. From this point onward, the malevolent energy in their home becomes impossible to ignore. Peter begins hearing the distinct clicking sound Charlie used to make, and he sees her ghostly figure lurking in the shadows of his room. Annie becomes consumed by paranoia, convinced that they've opened a door to something far darker than her daughter's spirit. Desperate for answers, Annie delves into her late mother Ellen's belongings and uncovers a series of disturbing clues. She finds old photographs of Ellen alongside Joan, revealing that the two women were deeply connected. More alarmingly, Annie discovers Ellen's involvement in a secretive cult dedicated to summoning a demonic entity known as Paimon, one of the 8 kings of hell. The cult's objective is clear: to summon Paimon into a suitable host body, and for reasons Annie cannot yet fully grasp, her family has been intricately woven into this plan. Meanwhile, Peter's experiences become more terrifying and violent. At school, he hears Joan's voice shouting incantations at him from afar, even though she isn't physically there. At home, he finds himself stalked by an invisible force that seems intent on breaking him, both mentally and physically. As the pieces of the puzzle fall into place, Annie makes another horrifying discovery. Her mother's grave has been desecrated, and Ellen's decapitated corpse is now in the family's attic, surrounded by ritualistic symbols. The house itself has become a stage for something unspeakably evil, and there's no denying that the Graham family is at the heart of a larger, sinister plan. With her family unraveling and danger closing in, Annie faces the chilling realization that she may have unwittingly brought this curse upon them. As night falls, the shadows in the house grow darker, and the family's descent into madness seems inevitable. The Graham household plunges deeper into chaos as the supernatural forces surrounding them grow increasingly hostile. Peter, haunted by terrifying visions and inexplicable events, becomes paralyzed by fear. Annie, now fully aware of her mother's connection to the demonic cult, realizes that the family has been manipulated into playing a role in a malevolent ritual, but the full extent of this plan is only just beginning to unfold. One evening, while searching for answers, Annie finds a book among Ellen's belongings that confirms her darkest suspicions. The symbol associated with Paimon, which matches the pendant worn by both her mother and herself, is also engraved on the utility pole that caused Charlie's death. The book explains that Paimon requires a male host and immense suffering to complete his ascension into the human world. Annie begins to connect the dots: her family's tragedies, the strange behaviors of her mother, and the cult's interest in Peter. They've all been part of a carefully orchestrated plot to summon Paimon. Meanwhile, Peter's mental state deteriorates rapidly. He starts hearing the eerie clicking sound Charlie used to make, and he feels an oppressive presence around him at all times. At school, he experiences a horrifying episode where his body is seized by an unseen force, contorting his face and slamming his head violently onto his desk. The attack leaves him bloody and traumatized, prompting Steve to pick him up and take him home. Back at the house, Annie reveals to Steve what she's discovered: the desecrated body of her mother in the attic and the cult's ritualistic intent to use Peter as Paymon's host. However, Steve, ever the skeptic, believes Annie is losing her grip on reality. When she attempts to destroy Charlie's sketchbook, believing it to be a link to the spirit world, she begs Steve to help. But when he refuses, Annie throws the book into the fire herself. To her horror, Steve is engulfed in flames instead, burning alive in front of her eyes. At that moment, Annie's body becomes possessed by the entity, her demeanor shifting into something entirely inhuman. Peter awakens later that night, disoriented and unaware of the horrors awaiting him. As he explores the house, he finds his father's charred corpse and feels the overwhelming presence of something sinister. Shadows shift, and Peter realizes he's being watched. His mother, now fully under the control of Paymon's influence, appears in the shadows, clinging to the ceiling like a predatory spider. Peter panics and flees to the attic, locking the hatch behind him. Inside the attic, Peter discovers a chilling scene: ritual symbols painted on the walls, candles burning in a circle, and his grandmother's decapitated corpse posed in worship. The space reeks of death and malevolence. As Peter tries to make sense of what he's seeing, Annie breaks into the attic. Now utterly inhuman, she begins to saw through her own neck with a piece of wire, her expression eerily blank as she decapitates herself in front of her son. Overwhelmed by terror, Peter jumps out of the attic window, crashing to the ground below. His lifeless body lies still for a moment before a strange glow, like a shimmering light, descends upon him. The light enters his body and he slowly rises, no longer Peter but the host for Paimon. Drawn to the treehouse outside, Peter, or Paimon, follows an unseen pull. Inside, he finds a group of naked cult members kneeling in worship. They surround a macabre altar, where a mannequin adorned with Charlie's decapitated head and a crown awaits. Joan and other cult members bow before Peter, hailing him as their new king. Joan places the crown on Peter's head, proclaiming him the human vessel of Paimon, and the cult members chant in reverence. The film ends on this chilling note, as the cult celebrates the completion of their ritual. The Grahams have been reduced to pawns in a plan that spans generations. What began as a story of familial grief and dysfunction transforms into an exploration of hereditary evil, showing how deeply rooted trauma and darkness can manifest in terrifying ways. In Hereditary, director Ari Aster delivers a harrowing tale of loss, manipulation, and supernatural horror, blending psychological torment with occult terror. It's a film that leaves viewers questioning the extent to which our lives are shaped by the legacies of those who came before us.